My brother chose me out at family dinner. One folder made him start shouting, "My name is Sarah Mitchell. I am 33 years old, and last week my own brother decided to vote me out of the family during dinner." It sounds ridiculous even saying it out loud, but I was sitting at the far end of a long wooden table inside his restaurant, the same place I had helped keep alive more times than I could count, when he suddenly pushed his chair back and stood up as if he were running a corporate meeting instead of hosting a family meal. My fork froze halfway to my mouth as he cleared his throat and raised his voice loud enough for the kitchen staff to hear. He said they had discussed things, that there had been a vote, and that I was no longer family. For a brief second, I truly thought it had to be some cruel joke, something awkward and poorly timed. But then I heard the applause, my parents clapping, my younger sister joining in hesitantly, a couple of relatives he had invited nodding along like this was some brave announcement. My chest went cold, but my face stayed still. Years in boardrooms had taught me how to keep composure when someone tried to ambush me instead of reacting. I inhaled slowly, reached down beside my chair, and placed a thick navy blue folder on the table. The sound of the cardstock sliding across the tablecloth felt louder than it should have. My brother Mark noticed it immediately, and for the first time that night his confident smile faltered. His eyes flicked from my face to the folder and back again. "So that is it?" I asked quietly. "You held a vote?" He nodded with his jaw tight and said it was done. Something in his tone told me he expected me to beg or lash out. Instead, I let out a small laugh, calm and controlled, and told him he probably would not be needing this anymore. I pushed the folder toward him. He opened it, flipped the first page, and I watched the color drain from his face. By the third page, his smile was gone. By the fifth, his hands were shaking. And when he reached the final document, his voice broke into a scream that echoed through the closed restaurant before I explained what he saw inside that folder, and why it caused such a reaction. Take a second and think about where you are right now, what time it is for you, and how strange it is that one family dinner can reach so far beyond one table. Because nothing about this situation happened overnight. I never planned to become my family unpaid accountant, therapist, and emergency fund. It just happened over time. When you are the person who understands numbers and consequences, people either respect that or take advantage of it, and in my family they chose the second option without ever admitting it out loud. As Mark flipped back to the first page with trembling fingers, I knew exactly what he was looking at because I had assembled every document myself the night before. Page 1 was a clean color-coded summary, a timeline of every bailout, every so-called temporary loan, every "can you just cover this for now" moment over the last 10 years. The total sat boldly at the bottom, $178,436. That number had lived quietly in my spreadsheets for years, but that night it stared everyone at the table in the face. Mark demanded to know what it was, his voice cracking halfway through the question. I told him he should explain it since he was the one who claimed I was distant and undeserving of a seat at the table. He flipped to the next tab and found a scanned promissory note under a clear sleeve, his signature, unmistakable, dated 3 years earlier on the night before his grand opening, when he had stood in my apartment kitchen, shaking while I printed the paperwork. He had promised to repay $60,000 within 5 years, with interest in exchange for me wiring the money that stopped the bank from pulling his startup loan. At the time I told myself I did not need a contract because he was my brother, because we were family, but I printed it anyway. I reminded him quietly that he signed it, that it saved him from default and helped secure his liquor license. He muttered that it was a betrayal, but the word lacked conviction. I corrected him calmly and told him it was documentation, nothing more. My parents leaned forward as their eyes tracked the lines on the page, and my mother Linda froze when she reached the section labeled medical expenses, her own name printed there. That tab held my credit card statements showing months of hospital charges after her insurance refused coverage for certain procedures, charges that drained my emergency fund twice just to keep collectors away. Then came the section that truly unsettled him. I saw a vein twitch in his neck when he reached the tab marked audio and messages. Inside were transcripts of voicemails and late-night texts printed neatly in black ink, each one paired with a QR code and a small USB stick clipped inside. Messages where he begged for money, where he asked me not to tell our parents how bad things were, where he cried from the walk-in fridge at 2 in the morning afraid he could not make payroll. I leaned forward and reminded him that he said nobody ever asked me to help, and I offered to play the recordings if you wanted everyone to hear the originals. His eyes flashed with anger as he accused me of weaponizing the past. But I kept my voice steady even though my pulse thundered in my ears. I told him I was simply putting the truth into print so it could not be rewritten by whoever shouted the loudest. My sister Anna finally spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper, asking if I really kept all of this. I met her gaze and asked if she would have believed me without it. She looked down at her lap, and for the first time doubt crept into her certainty. I told Mark that while he saw a folder, I saw 10 years of my life. 10 years of taking calls during meetings. 10 years of just this once turning into constant expectation. And when I finally said no, it somehow became justification to erase me. He slammed the folder shut like it burned his hands and accused me of keeping receipts, as if that disqualified me from being family. The word martyr left his mouth like an insult, and I realized that was exactly how they preferred to see me. Someone who suffered quietly and never held anyone accountable. The restaurant felt like a courtroom, forks frozen midair, wine glasses untouched, the closed sign on the door, turning the space into a private trial, and Mark acted like judge and jury. I asked him if he ever wondered whether the people who sacrifice for him feel appreciated, or if he just assumed they would keep bleeding so he did not have to. No one answered, and in that silence I realized the argument was never just about money. It was about belonging, about whether I was only family when I was useful. His words echoed in my head. We voted. You are not family anymore. I had heard terrible things in my career, but nothing cut like that. He tried to minimize it by saying I was making it bigger than it was, accusing me of turning everything into a dramatic narrative. But I reminded him. He stood up and held a secret ballot to exile me. I asked how much bigger it needed to be. He tried to interrupt, but I kept going. Years of being talked over had taught me to move quickly. I told him it felt like I had been the scaffolding around a collapsing building, and instead of fixing the cracks, they decided the scaffolding was the problem. My father John tried to downplay it, saying Mark was just tired of feeling judged. But that word had followed me my whole life. Judged for being honest. Judged for setting boundaries. Judged for not disappearing quietly. When I looked at Mark then, I saw not guilt but fear. Fear of losing control of the story he told everyone about me. I asked him if he thought I enjoyed tracking every payment. If he thought it thrilled me to remember when I paid for new ovens or a $15,000 patio upgrade so he could host weddings. I explained I only started documenting everything when I realized he rewrote the past every time we argued. He mocked me for bringing a scorecard to dinner, and I reminded him he was the one who turned love into a contest by voting someone out, turning family into majority. Rulana asked why I never said something sooner, and I told her every attempt ended with me being labeled dramatic or ungrateful. I reminded Mark of the time he accused me of buying the right to be difficult by paying bills, a memory that stunned me into silence then but fueled me now. I told him I saw a man who begged for help when it suited him and resented the proof once it existed. He stood again shouting that I thought I was better than him, accusing me of hiding behind a corporate job and spreadsheets. I stood too, hating that we looked like rival executives instead of siblings, and told him I never thought I was better. I thought I was responsible, and that was the real problem. For a moment, my vision blurred and I imagined a future I had quietly hoped for. Birthdays and kids running around, laughter and survival after something hard. But that image shattered as quickly as it came, replaced by the reality of my mother fighting tears, my father slumped in his chair, my sister staring at her plate, and my brother glaring like he had already lost something he never valued properly. I asked softly what family really meant if you could be voted out like an employee, and no one answered. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerators, and that was when Mark flipped to the very last page of the folder, his eyes scanning the text, his breathing changing, and then the screaming began. Mark's scream ripped through the room as his finger stabbed at the final page. His voice cracked and raw as he shouted that I could not do this. My father's chair scraped as he leaned forward, demanding to know what the page meant. Before Mark could twist the story, I answered calmly and said it was a letter from my attorney, a formal notice stating my intent to withdraw my personal guarantee from the loan keeping the restaurant alive. My mother's hand flew to her mouth and her breath caught. The weight of the moment settled over the table like heavy fog. I reminded Mark that I warned him weeks earlier, when he demanded more money, and laughed when I said I was done being his emergency exit. I explained slowly that, without my name attached, the bank would reevaluate everything. They would see that the only person with stable income and solid credit was stepping away, and they could call the loan or force renegotiation or demand another guarantor. Mark turned red and accused me of destroying his life over a fight. I told him he tried to erase me over a vote, and all I was doing was stepping aside and letting his choices catch up with him. Anna shook her head, asking if there was truly no other way. I told her I offered many ways, including restructuring debt and setting boundaries, and every attempt was dismissed as controlling or dramatic. Mark glared at me like an animal, backed into a corner and warned me about what this would due to our parents and to him. I answered that maybe he should have thought about that before deciding I was expendable. My mother rushed to say I was not expendable, and I repeated quietly that they voted. She winced and tried to claim they were not thinking clearly, but I told her they were thinking exactly as clearly as they wanted, believing Mark would always be the golden child and I would always be the safety net. My father finally snapped and demanded to know what I wanted. What would make me stay? The question hung there heavier than any accusation. I took a breath and said I wanted them to admit what they did. Not just the money, but the way they used me and treated me like an outsider, unless I was useful. I wanted them to say it out loud. Mark laughed bitterly and mocked me for wanting a confession. I told him to call it whatever he wanted, but until he could speak the truth, I would not put my name on anything else. The letter would go out Monday morning, if nothing changed. In my head, I imagined people watching this moment somewhere thinking I was ruthless, but I also imagined someone realizing they were allowed to choose themselves. Mark slumped back into his chair, muttering that I could not seriously do this because I was his sister. I tilted my head and reminded him that minutes earlier he was certain I was not. He flinched and accused me of blowing everything out of proportion. The familiar phrase landed without power this time. I repeated exactly what he did in front of everyone and asked how it sounded out loud. My father tried to calm the room, saying we were all saying things we did not mean, but I told him gently that Mark meant it and that votes do not happen on impulse. My father admitted they thought if they showed me consequences for pulling away, I would come running back and try harder. I finished the thought for him, saying they wanted me to work more and give more to earn my place again. The silence that followed felt final. My mother reached across the table, saying, they did not think it through and only wanted to shock me into realizing how hurt they were. I looked at her hand and remembered holding it in hospital rooms and swiping my card while telling her not to worry. I asked softly how hurting me on purpose could ever be called love, and no one answered. I told them the truth was that I did not pull away because I stopped caring. I pulled away because every interaction felt transactional. Every message felt like the start of a request. Mark scoffed and said they were not allowed to need me then. I answered that they were allowed to need me but not entitled to me. Anna asked if walking away meant forever, and I said I did not know what forever looked like, but I knew what the next step was. And the next step was standing up and not sitting back down just because they panicked. Mark laughed without humor and warned me I would regret this and end up alone. That family was all I had. I told him family was not a trump card and asked what the word meant if it could be revoked by raised hands. I looked around the restaurant that once symbolized our shared grit and now felt hollow. I compared it to a broken ride that should have been shut down long ago. Flashy lights still working while the structure failed. I said I already tried to fix it, and when I suggested stopping they accused me of ruining the fun. My father said they raised me to be tough and loyal and not give up on family. I answered that they raised me to carry more than my share without complaint but never taught me what to do when the people I would sacrifice for were willing to watch me destroy myself. My mother whispered they thought I liked being the strong one. I admitted I liked feeling useful until useful became used. Anna begged for compromise and asked if I could stay with boundaries. I told her boundaries only work when people respect them, and ours were treated like obstacles. Explained that staying after being voted out would teach them they could treat me however they wanted and I would still come back as long as they said family. And I could not keep teaching that lesson. I imagined two futures. One where I apologized and nothing changed, and another where I walked away and everything became uncomfortable but honest. I chose the version where I could sleep at night. I said staying would turn me into someone resentful and bitter, and I refused to be that person just to keep them comfortable. Mark accused me of choosing money over blood, and I corrected him, saying I was choosing honesty over denial and accountability over convenience, and my sanity over expectations. I pushed my chair back and the sound felt final. Anna reached for me, asking what if nothing ever went back to how it was. I told her softly that how it was is what brought us here. My father warned me not to forget who was there for me as a child, and I said I would not forget, but I also would not forget who was there for me now. I picked up the folder, feeling lighter than when I arrived, and walked toward the door without looking back. The door closed behind me with a soft sound that felt louder than any shouting inside. The cool night air hit my face, and for a moment I just stood there breathing, my hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline drained away. The street outside Mark's restaurant looked exactly the same as it always had. Cars passing, neon signs glowing, people laughing as they walked by, unaware that something fundamental had just shifted inside me. I did not run. I did not cry right away. I simply walked to my car and sat there with my forehead resting against the steering wheel. letting the silence wrap around me like a blanket I did not know I needed. As I drove home, the city lights blurred and memories kept replaying themselves without permission. Every late-night call, every rushed transfer, every promise that things would be different next time. I realized how deeply trained I had been to measure my worth by how much chaos I could absorb. Walking away felt wrong in my body, even though my mind knew it was necessary. By the time I reached my apartment, my phone had already started buzzing with missed calls and messages. I did not open them. I placed my bag on the counter, poured a glass of water, and stared at the wall as if it might give me instructions for what came next. Sleep did not come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mark standing at the table shouting, my mother reaching for me, my father looking tired and confused, Anna staring down like the floor might rescue her. I kept replaying the vote itself, the way it had been announced so casually, as if my place in the family were a position that could be eliminated with raised hands. Somewhere between midnight and morning, I finally slept. Not peacefully but deeply enough to stop the loop for a few hours. When I woke up the next day, my phone was still face down on the nightstand. I turned it over slowly and saw dozens of notifications, texts from my parents asking me to call, messages from Mark swinging between rage and disbelief, a single message from Anna that simply said, please talk to me. My chest tightened, but I did not respond right away. Instead, I made coffee, opened my laptop, and reviewed the letter from my attorney once more. Every word felt heavy but clear. I reminded myself that clarity was not cruelty, even if others wanted to label it that way. By midday, I finally texted Anna back and told her I loved her but needed space. Her reply came quickly, saying she understood, even though I could feel the sadness behind the words. Later that afternoon, my mother called again and left a voicemail, crying softly and saying they never meant for things to go this far. I listened to it once and then archived it. Not out of spite, but because I knew if I replayed it again, I would fold. Old instincts die hard, and mine told me to fix things at any cost. Over the next few days, the story began to travel. Relatives reached out with carefully worded messages asking what really happened. A cousin implied I had overreacted. An aunt suggested family meetings were normal, and I should not take it personally. I noticed how quickly the narrative shifted toward my reaction instead of the action that caused it. The vote itself became background noise, while my refusal to quietly accept it became the problem. Recognizing that pattern hurt, but also strengthened my resolve. At work, I moved through meetings on autopilot, nodding at the right moments, delivering presentations with practiced calm. No one there knew that my family had effectively fired me from belonging, and part of me felt relief in that anonymity. I was Sarah Mitchell, the competent professional, not Sarah the emergency fund. During a lunch break, I caught my reflection in a glass window and barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked tired, but steadier than she had in years. By the end of the week, Mark sent a long message, accusing me of humiliating him and threatening everything he built. He said the bank was already asking questions and investors were nervous. He blamed me for destabilizing his business and stressed how much pressure he was under. Reading it, I felt that familiar pull to rescue, the urge to reply with solutions and reassurance. Instead, I closed the message and reminded myself that pressure was not new to him. Accountability was. Friday evening arrived quietly. I ordered takeout and ate alone on my couch. The stillness felt strange but not empty. Sometime after dinner, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Anna asking if she could come over. I hesitated only a moment before saying yes. When she arrived, her eyes were red and she hugged me tightly like she was afraid I might disappear. We sat at the kitchen table for a long time without talking. The silence between us different from the one at the restaurant. Softer and less sharp. Anna finally asked if I was really going through with it. I told her yes. She nodded slowly and said she was scared. Not just of what would happen to Mark, but of what this meant for all of us. I told her I was scared too. That choosing myself did not erase the grief of losing the family I thought I had. She admitted she never knew how much I carried because I always made it look easy. Hearing that stung more than criticism ever had. I told her that making it look easy was part of the problem. Before she left, Anna asked if I thought things could ever be normal again. I told her I did not know, but I knew pretending everything was fine had already broken us. She hugged me again and whispered that she was proud of me, even if she did not fully understand. After she left, I sat alone, feeling both lighter and lonelier. Growth rarely feels like victory in the moment. More often it feels like standing in unfamiliar space without a map. The following Monday morning, I received confirmation from my attorney that the letter had been sent. Seeing it in writing made my stomach drop. There was no undoing it now. I went to work and forced myself to focus. Around midday, my phone rang, and this time it was my father. His voice sounded older than I remembered. He asked if we could talk. Just the two of us. I agreed cautiously, and we met at a quiet cafe near my office later that afternoon. Sat across from me, stirring his coffee without drinking it. He said he did not sleep much since the dinner and admitted he kept replaying the moment Mark stood up to announce the vote. He said it felt wrong even then, but he went along with it because he did not want to challenge his son publicly. Hearing that hurt, but also explained more than he realized. I told him silence can be as loud as shouting. He nodded slowly and said he was starting to see that. He asked if I understood how scared Mark was, how much pressure he felt to keep the restaurant afloat. I answered that fear did not justify erasing someone who helped him survive. My father sighed and said he worried this would tear the family apart permanently. I told him the family was already torn and pretending otherwise would not mend it. We sat there for a long time talking more honestly than we had in years. When we parted, he hugged me awkwardly and said he hoped someday we would find a way back to each other. That evening my mother sent a message saying she loved me no matter what and wished she handled things differently. It was the closest to an apology I had received. I replied that I loved her too but needed time. Setting that boundary felt both painful and empowering. Each day after that brought small tests of my resolve. A crisis message from Mark that I ignored. A guilt-laden voicemail from a relative that I deleted. Each time I chose not to engage, I felt a strange mix of loss and relief. Weeks passed and slowly the intensity faded. My life settled into a new rhythm without constant emergencies. I noticed how much mental space I suddenly had. How evenings felt longer and mornings calmer. One night, as I cleaned out an old drawer, I found a stack of printed bank statements from years ago. Evidence of sacrifices I once believed defined my role. I stared at them for a moment and then shredded them. Not because the history no longer mattered, but because I no longer needed proof to justify my choices then. One afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from Anna that made my breath catch. She said the bank had officially scheduled a meeting with Mark and their investors. Tensions were high and nothing was certain. She did not ask me to fix it. She simply told me what was happening. I thanked her for the update and put my phone down, sitting quietly with the realization that events were now moving without my intervention. Whether things collapsed or stabilized would no longer be because of me. And that truth carried both sorrow and freedom. The week of the bank meeting passed slowly and every day felt stretched thin. I went to work and handled my responsibilities with the same steady focus I always had. But inside, I was bracing for impact. Not because I planned to intervene, but because detachment does not erase concern. Anna sent brief updates without commentary. Just facts. The meeting was tense. Investors were upset. Mark was defensive. The bank wanted answers that could not be smoothed over with charm. Reading those messages, I felt the old instinct flare again. The reflex to step in with spreadsheets and calm explanations. But I resisted it by reminding myself that stepping back was the very point when the meeting finally happened. Anna texted me afterwards saying it lasted hours and ended without resolution. The bank requested a full review of the finances and placed conditions on the loan that Mark had never faced before. I sat with that information quietly, letting it settle without reacting. The world did not collapse because I was not holding it together. Things were unstable but still standing. That realization chipped away at the belief that everything depended on me. Few days later, my father John called again, and this time, I answered without hesitation. His voice sounded tired and more honest than usual. He told me the stress had forced conversations they avoided for years. He admitted they never really understood how precarious the restaurant finances were because Mark shielded them with confidence and excuses. Hearing that confirmed what I always suspected. That transparency was sacrificed to protect egos. John said he was beginning to see how much pressure had been quietly placed on me and how unfair that was. He also told me my mother Linda was struggling with guilt, replaying moments when she leaned on me without asking how it affected my life. I listened without interrupting, not because it healed everything but because it mattered that someone finally acknowledged the weight I carried. John did not ask me to come back or to fix anything. He only said he hoped someday I could forgive them. I told him forgiveness was not the same as returning to old patterns, and he said he understood even if it hurts. Meanwhile, Mark grew more distant. His messages stopped entirely. Through Anna, I learned that his anger had shifted inward, no longer focused solely on me, but on the situation itself. He was forced to confront numbers he ignored and decisions he postponed. Investors demanded accountability and the bank required a new structure. For the first time, Mark could not rely on me to absorb the consequences. That reality shook his identity more than any argument ever could. At home, my life continued to open in unexpected ways. Without constant emergencies, my evenings became mine again. I cooked meals instead of grabbing whatever was fastest. I read books that had nothing to do with finance or problem solving. I slept through the night without my phone lighting up with requests. These changes seemed small, but together they felt revolutionary. Peace arrived quietly and stayed longer each day. One afternoon, a colleague noticed the difference and commented that I seemed lighter. I smiled without explaining because some transformations do not need justification. Around that time, an idea I once joked about began to take shape. Friends asked me how I learned to set boundaries so clearly, and how I finally stopped being the responsible one for everyone else. Those conversations sparked something in me. Not a business plan yet, but a sense of purpose beyond survival. Anna visited me again, a few weeks later. She looked exhausted but steadier. She told me the bank demanded Mark step back from full control if the restaurant was to survive. Negotiations were ongoing and nothing was guaranteed. She admitted she was seeing dynamics she never noticed before, and said the vote haunted her. Hearing that mattered more than an apology. It meant the silence was breaking. She asked how I was really doing, and I told her the truth. That some days I felt grief like a physical ache, and other days I felt relief so strong it surprised me. Both could exist at the same time. She nodded and said she was beginning to understand that love without boundaries was not kindness but self-erasure. Those words told me she was learning in her own way. As months passed, the outcome became clearer. The bank agreed to renegotiate under strict conditions. Mark was required to sell a majority share and bring in experienced management. It was a blow to his pride and a necessary correction to reality. My parents faced their own reckoning as well. Without my financial cushion, they had to make changes they resisted for years, including selling their large house and downsizing. None of it was easy, but none of it was fatal either. I heard all of this secondhand and processed it privately. There was sadness in knowing my family struggled, but also a strange peace in knowing it was no longer my burden to carry alone. The narrative that my absence would destroy them proved untrue. They adapted because they had to. Just as I had adapted to being without them during this time, I made a decision that felt both risky and inevitable. I left my corporate job and began building something of my own. A consulting practice focused on financial boundaries and recovery. What started as informal advice turned into structured work. I helped people untangle finances from guilt and obligation. Each client's story echoed pieces of my own and reinforced that I was not alone in this experience. When I told Anna about the business, she smiled through tears and said it made sense. She said I was turning pain into clarity, and that felt right. Her support meant more than she realized. It showed that connection could exist without dependence. We began meeting occasionally, just the two of us. No money, no crisis, just conversation. Those moments felt fragile but real. My parents reached out sporadically with updates and cautious warmth. We spoke without diving into the past, not because it was resolved, but because healing required patience. I no longer rushed to fill silence or fix discomfort. Letting space exist became its own form of respect. Slowly the tone shifted from expectation to curiosity, from need to choice. Mark remained distant. I did not hear from him directly for a long time. Part of me mourned that loss deeply. Another part accepted that accountability often creates distance before it creates growth. Whether he would ever reach out, I did not know, and I learned to live with that uncertainty without letting it define me. The first anniversary of the dinner approached. I reflected on how much had changed, not just externally but inside me. The fear of being alone had been replaced by trust in myself. The need for approval softened into self-respect. I understood now that walking away was not an act of cruelty but an act of survival. And survival had given way to something better, a life built on intention rather than obligation. One evening, as I closed my office for the day, I paused to appreciate the quiet satisfaction that filled me. I was no longer bracing for the next emergency, no longer measuring my worth by how much I could give away. The future felt open and uncertain in the best possible way, and for the first time I welcomed that uncertainty as proof that my life was finally my own. 6 months after the dinner, I found myself sitting in a small sunlit office that smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. My name etched on the frosted glass door outside. Sarah Mitchell Consulting. Financial Boundaries and Recovery. The words still felt surreal every time I saw them. What began as a half-joking idea shared with friends had quietly grown into something real. People reached out not because I advertised, but because word spread about someone who understood how money and family could twist together until you could not tell where obligation ended and self-destruction began. My corporate job had terrified me more than I admitted to anyone. For years, stability was my armor, my proof that I was responsible and reliable. Walking away from that safety net felt reckless, even though staying felt suffocating. Yet once I stepped out, I realized how much energy I reclaimed. Without constant emotional emergencies draining me, I poured myself into building something that aligned with my values. My days filled with conversations that mattered, helping people untangle guilt from generosity and teaching them that no was not a betrayal. One afternoon my phone buzzed with a message from Anna that made my stomach tighten out of old habit. She wrote that the bank officially sent notice. Mark was furious. My mother was panicking. And my father was finally asking questions he should have asked years ago. I stared at the screen, feeling that familiar urge to intervene, to call and soothe and strategize. Habits built over decades do not vanish quietly. They tap you on the shoulder and remind you how easy it would be to step back in. Before I could reply, another message came through from Anna telling me she was not asking me to fix it. She just wanted me to know they were dealing with the mess without me. It was ugly, but it was theirs. I exhaled slowly and felt something loosen inside my chest. I asked her how she was doing instead of how I could help. She replied that she missed me and had been reading about boundaries. She said the comments she saw everywhere repeated the same idea, that you can love people and still choose yourself. She said she was starting to understand. That message stayed with me long after I put the phone down. It felt like a quiet victory, not over my family, but over the story that once defined me. The idea that my worth depended on how much I endured. Weeks later, Anna asked if we could meet, just the two of us. No votes, no money, no crisis, just sisters. My throat tightened when I read it. I told her yes without hesitation. We met at a small cafe halfway between our homes, sunlight spilling across the table as we talked about ordinary things at first. Work frustrations, books she was reading, the strange relief of sleeping through the night. Eventually the conversation turned heavier. She apologized, not for the vote alone but for the way she stayed quiet when it mattered. I told her I never expected her to carry what I carried and that I was proud of her for questioning it now. We left that cafe lighter than when we arrived. Something fragile but hopeful settling between USA. Year after the vote, I heard through Anna and a couple of cousins who still followed my life online that Parker & Sons had new owners. The bank renegotiated the loan on the condition that Mark stepped down and sell his majority share. He kept a small percentage but no longer controlled the business. My parents sold their large house and moved into a smaller place. The world did not end. They did not starve. They did not collapse without my credit score holding everything together. Hearing that brought a wave of complicated emotions. Sadness for what was lost. Relief that my absence did not destroy them. Validation that the catastrophe I was warned about never came. They survived without me, just as I survived without them. The story that I was indispensable proved false. And in that falseness, I found freedom. Mark did not reach out right away. Months passed without a word. Then one evening, an unfamiliar number appeared on my phone, his name attached. My heart raced as I stared at it, debating whether to answer. I did not owe him access to me, but I answered anyway. His voice sounded different, quieter, stripped of bravado. He did not apologize outright, but he acknowledged that things spiraled after I left and admitted he never realized how much he leaned on me until I was gone. I listened without interrupting, not rushing to soothe or fix. When he finished, I told him I hoped he figured things out and that I wished him well. I did not offer to step back in or soften the boundary I built. The call ended without resolution but also without hostility. It was enough for now. My relationship with my parents remained cautious. We spoke occasionally, exchanged updates and polite warmth. Love still existed, but it no longer came with expectations. I accepted that this version of connection was all that was available right now. And that was okay. Grief does not disappear when you choose yourself. It simply changes shape. As my business grew, I met people whose stories mirrored mine in haunting ways. Daughters funding siblings' dreams, sons rescuing parents from financial collapse, partners carrying debts they never created. Each time I shared my experience, I saw recognition flicker in their eyes. Helping them set boundaries felt like stitching together pieces of myself that once felt broken. There were days I missed my family so intensely it felt physical. Holidays especially carried that ache. But there were also days filled with laughter and ease. Dinners with friends where no one asked me for anything except my presence. Moments where I realized hours had passed without thinking about the vote. Those moments were quiet proof of healing. People often say blood is thicker than water, as if that ends every argument. But the fuller meaning suggests that bonds chosen can be stronger than those assigned at birth. I learned that loyalty without limits is not love, it is erasure. I did not stop being a sister or a daughter the night I walked out of that restaurant. My family stopped being my safe place. So I built a new one. Looking back, now I understand that the folder I carried into that dinner was never about revenge. It was about truth. It held evidence not just of money exchanged but of years spent believing my value came from sacrifice. Putting it on the table forced everyone, including me, to confront a reality we avoided. Walking away afterward was not the end of my family story. It was the beginning of my own. If someone told me years ago that choosing myself would lead here, to peace built slowly and imperfectly, I might not have believed them. Fear has a way of convincing you that the familiar pain is safer than the unknown. But standing on the other side, I know now that discomfort is not the same as danger. Sometimes it is simply the cost of growth. I do not know what the future holds with my family. Maybe time will soften things further. Maybe it will not. What I know is that my life is no longer shaped by votes held without me or expectations I never agreed to. It is shaped by intention, by choices made with clarity rather than fear. Somewhere out there another woman is sitting at a table being told she does not belong unless she proves her worth. She might be holding back tears or swallowing anger, wondering if she is selfish for wanting more. If my story reaches her, I hope she understands this. Choosing yourself does not make you cruel. It makes you honest, and honesty is where healing begins.